welcome to this week's Cabin Fever webinar, where we're rolling out the red carpet for an industry legend. Thank you, Alan Kohler, for joining us this morning.
Not at all. Pleasure to be with you.
Alan, let's start by looking back over your career. And if you don't mind, I'll just do a brief run through over the last, you've been a financial journalist for 46 years, starting initially as a cadet in the Australian, covering the Sidon nickel boom and bust. That's taking things back a little bit. You were a columnist at the editor and editor of the AFR, columnist of The Age and the Sydney Morning Herald, editor of The Age. For the past 21 years, you've been working for ABC, first as a business editor of the 7:30 Report, and then host of Inside Business and finance presenter for ABC News. You were founder of the Eureka Report and Business Spectator. Eureka Report's now owned by InvestSmart Group, which we'll talk about in a bit, along with Intelligent Investor and Your Share. In December 2018, you joined InvestSmart Group as the group's editor-in-chief, and you're also an inductee into the Australian Media Hall of Fame. That's incredibly impressive career, which seemed to have started straight out of high school. Was it a case that you knew what you wanted to do from an early age? And looking back now, take us through some of the highlights and turning points in your career.
Well, I'm sorry to say that it's 50 years, not 46, which is a horrifying thought, but there you are. So I started when I was 18. I'm now 68. Yes, so straight out of high school, I got a job as a copy boy on the Australian in Melbourne. It happened to be that the job that was available was on the finance section of the Australian. So that's where I landed, in the finance section of the Australian. Got a cadetship, and in those days, journalism was a trade, not a profession, so that pretty well everybody did the apprenticeship as opposed to a degree, and it's only later in the 80s and 90s that it became what you might call a profession, where everyone now has a degree, and often a degree in journalism most of the time. So anyway, that was my beginning, and I sort of learnt on the job, did a lot of reading, and I guess progressed from there. So the highlights, I suppose. My sort of career took off when I became the Chanticleer columnist on the back page of the Financial Review in 1979. Bob Gottliebson, who had started that column in 1974, hired me as a young understudy to replace him because he knew he was going to move on. And so I did replace him, and I managed to be able to do it. So that was, and I did it well enough to be plucked from that job to run the paper. So I moved up to Sydney from Melbourne in '84, and ran the Financial Review through the middle of the 1980s until it was sold to Robert Holmes à Court. But that deal fell through. I mean, I don't know whether you want to go into those sort of stories, but it was kind of an interesting time for the world and for Fairfax at the time.
Mm. And I've read reference to your corduroy jacket and hush puppy wearing days as a young bearded journalist, and a comment that really struck out for me was, and I'll quote, "Alan has a capacity to bring personality to financial commentary and a capacity to highlight charts and reveal more about humanity than just finance." Now, they say a picture tells 1,000 words. The way you use charts in your financial commentary, certainly, I think for me, certainly helps convey the message, I think, more quickly and more effectively than the written word. Is this approach something that you said you learned on the job? Is this approach something that you felt was missing, or is it something that came naturally? I, for one, find the charts incredibly effective in terms of financial journalism as an approach.
Well, I don't know why, or how this came about, but I guess I've always approached my job and journalism in general as a customer focused task. You know, so I'm there to provide a service to people. That's what I do. I'm not there to change the world. I'm there to deliver a service, and the service is to tell you what's going on, and to explain it. So look, that's what I'm focused on. I've always felt that a couple of things are important about that. I mean, it's no good explaining things if the person you're explaining it to doesn't understand it. So I have always focused in my journalistic life. I've always focused on the writing. So in the early days, one of the most important books for me was Fowler's Modern English Usage, which is grammar, how to do grammar. And so I used to read that from cover to cover several times and force myself to understand grammar. Grammar, which possibly gone out of fashion, but it's basically the business of writing clearly. It's simply a matter of how to use punctuation, how to use words, how to use sentences in such a way that you express yourself clearly. And so that's been my focus through my career, really, is to express myself clearly. And the other thing is to do it in such a way that the people who are reading what I've got to do or watching me find it pleasurable, because what you want is for people to want to come back and read what you've said or watch you on TV to do it again because they liked it. And so what I try to do is make them smile, because people like to smile. It's relatively simple. People
it's
like
a simple concept.
It's a simple concept. People like to smile. People like to feel a little bit happy. And so if I can combine the business of telling them what's going on in such a way that they get it and they find it pleasurable, then I've succeeded. That's kind of really what I'm trying to do.
Yeah, great.
And that's what I've focused on for my entire career.
Well, it's certainly been, it's been very effective. As you say, the industry has changed quite significantly over the past 40 years. In some cases, obviously driven by technology, in some cases, largely for the worse. What do you think the future of Australian media looks like, considering the point you made about how much grammar and that has changed over the past few years?
Well, media generally, not just in Australia, but around the world, has been hit by a real tsunami, which is the arrival of these platforms that, how can I say, that basically publish whatever is given to them. I'm talking mainly about Facebook, but it's also Instagram and other social media. So, whereas publishing normally requires that you have to check what is published, and you've got to make sure it's correct. That's kind of the way publishing works generally, and that requires staff to do that. Social media people just publish whatever is there, and they don't really check it. They respond to complaints, but it means that their cost base is quite low. Obviously, it's negligible cost base because nothing has to be checked. And the amount of stuff they publish is obviously colossal. Huge amounts of stuff gets published. I'm sort of boiling it down to a relatively kind of mundane sounding thing, but the fact is, what we do in the media is we compete for people's time, and if there's just this kind of waterfall of content appearing on Facebook and on Twitter and Instagram and so on, that's taking up people's time, and they have less time to consume what the paid for journalists do. So, it's inevitable that there's less consumption of that. So, obviously what's been happening over the past kind of 10 years or so has been that the media has been shrinking, and the number of people engaged in the media has been shrinking. Now, question is, how has it finished shrinking? Has it got further to shrink? I don't know. I suspect it has further to shrink. Will it continue to? I think that, I think a lot of smaller publications, regional newspapers, probably will disappear. Will the major ones eventually disappear? Obviously I hope not. But yeah, I don't know.
There's also this element of, we're living in an age of alternative facts, or fake news, as Trump likes to call it. This element of looking at journalism's role in sort of record keeping and truth telling, versus, as you said, these social media platforms that just kind of publish anything. I suppose that's a challenge for journalists. How do they operate, and how do they compete with that social media, those social media platforms? That's really, I suppose, a significant challenge looking ahead, right?
Yeah, well, it's difficult because, as you say, they publish anything, and so that they're an entirely different, in a way, they're an entirely different kind of medium.
Yeah.
So look, I don't really know what the answer to that is. The thing is that these platforms, all of them really, Google, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and so on, they're utilities, and they've been allowed to develop and grow as private companies that are virtually unregulated. Now, traditionally, utilities are regulated, right? Electricity companies, gas companies, telco companies, and so on. Everyone accepts the fact that they are regulated, their prices are regulated, and what they do and how they treat people is defined and decided and run and regulated by the government. And there are special regulators, in fact, who do that. Now, that didn't happen with these, what I call utilities. That did not happen with them. Now, I think Facebook is as central a utility to our lives as the electricity company or the telecommunications company, but it just happens to be entirely private, unregulated, and run by a bloke named Mark Zuckerberg, who has become fabulously rich. Now, I think that's been just one of those things that slipped through. It shouldn't have slipped through, but it did. Now, the question, we're starting to find, in particular in Europe, the EU is beginning to say, well, hang on, we've got to do something about this. And they're starting to try to regulate these things, but it's very difficult because they're so powerful. And the people who are running them are so rich now that it's just difficult. I think that it's possible the cat's out of the bag.
Yeah, they've got a lot of resources. Yeah, absolutely. Well, maybe we'll move a little bit closer to where we are today. I don't want to talk too much about COVID. I know it's a topic that everyone feels like we've beaten to death, but looking at where we are now, keen to hear your thoughts on the recovery. And also if we see what's going on with China, from an Australian exports perspective, the impact on us, but also imports, they're the largest source of tourism into Australia. How do you see us? And there's reference to L-shaped and U-shaped and W-shaped curves and all the rest of it. How do you see us coming through the next few months? What do you think the recovery looks like?
Well, I don't think it looks like a V or possibly even a U. I don't really know. I think that using the alphabet to describe the recovery is a bit problematic. This recession is very different to all previous ones. Previous recessions have been caused by an increase in interest rates, generally to control inflation, or a credit squeeze that's happened spontaneously. So that's what occurred in the GFC was a global credit squeeze caused by the collapse of American housing, in turn caused by the fact that the banks overlent in the US to housing. But this time around, obviously, it's a deliberate recession caused by governments locking down their economies in order to control the pandemic. And so, to a very large extent, the outcome of it, or the coming out of it, is in the hands of the virus itself, and in the hands of how that now, how the kind of the lockdowns are eased. Now, obviously, in Australia, we're easing the lockdowns. However, it isn't it's not the case that all of the lack of activity is due to government-imposed lockdowns. People are themselves frightened of the virus, and also we're coming out of it, sure, but suddenly it's not, the restaurants are opening, but only 10 people are allowed in. Everyone's got to stay apart. I think it'll be a long time before we're sitting next to each other at the footy or at the theatre. So I think that it's possible, it's likely, it seems to me, that, until there's a vaccine, we're going to have social distancing either imposed or, people wanting to do it because they're frightened of getting the disease. I think it's a long time, for example, before the airline industry goes back to normal. I mean, the traffic at Sydney Airport, I just read this morning, is down 97.5%. I mean, that's virtually zero, obviously.
Yeah. Wow.
And I suppose the only traffic going on there is freight. But is that going to snap back to where it was? No, it's certainly not.
No.
It's going to take a very long time. And there's a whole lot of industries and businesses and employment that relies on that. So I think that it's going to take a long time for that. Yeah. So it won't be, it'll be like if there's any analogy, it's more like a reverse square root thing where it goes along, goes down, and then goes back up to about halfway, possibly, I don't know, for quite a while.
And from sort of sectors to look out for, I read even this morning in the AFR, there was reference to, assets supporting electric vehicles and digital infrastructure. I, for one, I think, people are creatures of habit, and I think over time we'll probably revert back to the norm with a few changes here and there. I don't see that, there'll all of a sudden be this massive switch into electrical vehicles and digital infrastructure and that. But keen to hear your thoughts on the sectors that you think people should be possibly looking out for in the coming months.
Well, the two obvious ones that spring to mind are online shopping, online retail, and generally data. I think that there's going to be, Australia's penetration of online shopping is about 8% of the total retail sales. In other countries, Europe and America, it's more like 20%. So I think that this will cause a significant increase. Whether it goes from 8 to 20%, I don't know, but it's certainly going to be there's going to be a step up in the amount of online shopping, and we will to some extent catch up. And I think in general around the world, there's going to be an increase in the use of online shopping, simply because people have got into the habit of it. I interviewed Ruslan Kogan, who runs the Australian online store, Kogan.com. They had, in the past 2 months, they've had 200,000 extra customers, which is enormous for them. And also the amount of stuff that their existing customers are buying has almost doubled. Those people will start going back to the shops again. But I think that what they buy online will stay elevated because they're just in the habit of it. They're used to it. A lot of people have started getting groceries. I've started getting groceries delivered, and it's great. It's fine. It certainly beats going to the supermarket. So I think we'll probably keep doing that. The other industry that's doing really well in terms of their share prices and so on is data, internet data. There's a company called NextDC, which runs data centers. It's doing really well. Its demand is unprecedented. There's another company called Megaport, which has undersea cables. It sort of delivers the internet into Australia. It's also doing extremely well and trying to increase its capacity. And this is really about people working from home, watching Netflix more. So I think there's probably going to be a step up in streaming of video, which will be also relatively permanent. And the working from home thing is also leading to distributed internet. So a friend of mine who works for one of the banks has been told that only 20 to 40% of the staff on their particular section of the bank will be coming back to the office. The rest, that is to say 60 to 80% of the staff in this section, will be working from home, they've been told, for a year. So that's very interesting, I think.
It's a significant percentage. I mean, what are the impact on real estate in the city? I mean, all that office space.
So that's right. That's a huge implication. I've been kind of thinking about that as well, and looking at what's been going on in the offices. Everyone has to be distant now. So there's going to be fewer people who can go to the office. I think part of the reason they've been told that only 40% or so can come back to the office is because they can't get as many people into the offices anymore because they have to be further apart. So that means that it's possible that the office buildings will remain full. That is to say, there won't be empty floors because there'll just be fewer people filling up the same amount of space. And the question is not so much whether the office towers are going to be empty, but whether the companies can continue to pay the rent for the office towers when they have fewer people sitting in them. And I think to some extent that will depend on who pays for the people working at home. Because I think what's going to happen, it looks like, is that the taxpayers are going to pay for the people working at home. The companies are not going to be paying a percentage of their rent or mortgage and a percentage of the heating and cooling and all that stuff. They'll just go on the tax. There'll be tax deductions. So I think that's kind of interesting. And probably the companies will continue to rent the space, the same amount of space with fewer people in them. Anyway.
There's all sorts of challenges there, right? On the trains, in the lifts. It's just, it'll be interesting to see how we deal with that in the coming months. And what do you think about manufacturing? And, all this talk about not relying on China to produce that. Do you think we'll see an uptake in manufacturing in Australia as opposed to offshore on the back of this?
Well, if you take a step back, over the past 2 or 3 decades, the world has come to rely on global just-in-time supply chains to supply virtually everything. I mean, globalization is a thing; it's happened. Obviously, China is at the center of it. But it's not just China; it's Bangladesh, it's Philippines, it's Philippine call centers. There's Bangladesh clothing manufacturer and so on. So gradually, the corporate world has built these incredibly complex but efficient supply chains that have delivering products around the world, and they're not just. It's not just a matter of making a product somewhere and then shipping that product to somewhere else. The parts for everything are coming from all over the place. The parts for our iPhones come from a dozen or more different countries, and they're assembled in one place and then delivered to everywhere else in the world. So all this complexity of supply chain has been taken for granted. We're all just happy with it. It's worked fine. And all of a sudden, I think we've had a wake-up call that maybe this system is fragile. And, it's been shown to be fragile. Suddenly, when countries close down, that can't, the whole thing falls apart. And so I think that a lot of countries, including Australia, will have to re-examine their reliance on imports and exports to some extent, and are going to have to say, well, okay, what do we need to make here, and what can we have delivered? So I do think, as to what that is, I don't know. I mean, I think there's obviously the question of sort of security things that are sensitive. To what extent do countries need to be self-sufficient now? I mean, there's no sign of countries or governments doing that yet. I think probably they should be. I hope they're doing it beneath the surface, but there's no talk about it yet. About sort of investigating the extent to which we're self-sufficient. I would expect something like the Morrison government to appoint a commission of inquiry into that, and to report in 12 months' time as to what we need to do as a nation for ourselves, and what we need to, because it's not an easy answer.
No, not at all. I mean, you'd imagine, we'll talk about the US for a bit. You'd imagine, obviously, Trump kicked that off a bit before the pandemic started, just looking at what they manufacture onshore. I mean, how do you see things unfolding there? I mean, the US seems to be quite dire. They're lifting restrictions. Everyone's getting back to work. The spread certainly is far from subsiding. How do you see that playing out in the coming weeks? I mean, Trump's now self-medicating. I saw you refer to him recently as a narcissist or an idiotic narcissist or something like that on Twitter. Obviously, what are your thoughts on how that's going to unfold?
Look, I think in that piece that you referred to, I think that America's in diabolical trouble as a nation. I think Donald Trump is exactly the worst kind of leader to have in a crisis like this. because he just doesn't understand it, can't really deal with it properly, and is not capable of providing the sort of leadership that is required. I mean, I think we're seeing kind of such an incredibly wide variety of leadership around the world, and the results are in the cases and deaths and economic performance. And I think Scott Morrison's come out of it pretty well so far.
Yeah.
Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil is possibly the worst, and Donald Trump is down there. So look, I said in that article that I think the fate of America has gone to the top of my concerns about the long-term consequence of COVID-19, and it still is there. I think America, could. I mean, there are. I don't want to get too alarmist here, but there are 400 million guns in America, and
yes.
they all get terribly upset. They're all marching in the street about the lockdowns. But if they have to lock down again, in 3 months' time, goodness knows what will happen.
Yeah, we're already seeing some violence over there on the back of frustration due to the lockdown. And as you say, there's a lot of guns out there. So I mean, that is a big concern. One of the questions that came through, just going back to a previous topic, was so arguably we could see more onshoring. I think that could be something that doesn't involve too much, in terms of infrastructure and that, just additional services and that we could run from onshore.
Well, yes, but I think the problem is going to be the skill of our workforce. I think that vocational education and training in Australia has been a joke for 10 years or so. And I think that we've let the skills of our workforce slide because we haven't had to worry about it. We've just let the car manufacturing industry close. All those car workers, whatever they're doing, driving Ubers and making coffee, the skills of the workforce skills have gone to a large extent, and I think that in order to do any kind of substantial onshoring, there's going to have to be a focus on education and training, to the extent that I think the government, is certainly not prepared for.
Yeah. Well, maybe moving on to a lighter topic, and then I'd like to talk to you about InvestSmart as well, and certainly invite anyone listening in to put questions through. And while that happens, going back to December 14, Alan, there was a report on ABC New Year's Eve where you outlined the metrics of New Year's Eve partying, the Chundabel curve, which I found very entertaining as I read through it. You had ranges of different barfing and major ralphing and maximum mouth crying, which I'd never heard of before, all the way through to 2 p.m. How did this news report come about that you presented around midnight on TV?
Well, the ABC had the job of doing this thing, and there's a group of producers who put together that program, that New Year's Eve program, and they had this idea of getting me to do a sort of spurious finance report, and so they asked me to do it. So there you go. But note that I wasn't asked back. I didn't do it in 2015, so I don't know. It's certainly didn't become a regular feature of the New Year's Eve.
I've never heard of maximum mouth crying before. That was very entertaining. So, Alan, tell us a bit about InvestSmart. So you've been there since December 18. How's that going? How did that come about?
Well, I started this investment newsletter called Eureka Report in 2005, just on myself with a bit of money from some investment backers. And that went quite well. We also started a business called Business Spectator. I think you referred to that in the intro. That was 2007. We started that. That did okay as well. We sold both of those businesses to News Corp in 2012. And they then, News Corp ended up selling Eureka Report to InvestSmart 4 years later in 2016. At that point, I went off on my own to try my hand at starting something of my own that was 100% owned by me, called The Constant Investor. which went okay. It wasn't great. It wasn't, it was just okay. But it didn't, it never really kind of got to where I'd want it to be. InvestSmart, as owners of Eureka Report at that point, approached me and said, why don't we buy the Constant Investor and you come back and run Eureka Report for us? That was 2018, and I said, sure. And so I sold the Constant Investor to InvestSmart for not very much, and joined InvestSmart as the editor-in-chief of Eureka Report, and which is what I'm doing now, as well as appearing on the ABC and writing columns for the Australian. So I feel very lucky to be doing all that. It's great.
Yeah, it's well, certainly. It seems to be going incredibly well in InvestSmart. I mean, the business is showing some great growth. It's certainly resonating with the people. I mean, you've got quite a range of portfolios. It's mostly ETF. I mean, it's significant. I saw Chris from StockSpot, who's on with us next week, make reference to the growth in investing in ETFs. It's seen significant uptake
yes, well,
in the use of ETFs.
The thing that really enticed me and got me across the line to join InvestSmart was the fact that at the time they decided to cap their fees. So they've got these portfolios, investment portfolios, and they provide advice, tax reporting, general reporting, and sort of rebalancing and so on. So a kind of full service, a full sort of advisory service on top of the portfolios. But unlike most financial advice, in fact, all of it, the fee is capped at $451 per year. So no matter how much money you put in, you can't pay more than that. And most advice and investment products, apart from this one, really, percentages where the percentage, the amount of fee just keeps growing. So if you put 10 million in, it's still 0.5% or whatever it is.
Yeah.
Or 1%, whereas with InvestSmart it's not. So I thought that was great. It's the first real investment house to cap fees. I've been complaining and campaigning against percentage fees for a very long time because of the way the percentage fees compound. The problem with having a percentage fee is it might sound a small amount of money, but over time it grows into a large amount of money because it compounds along with the fees. Along with the returns.
Yeah. We've got another question come through. How does the mining sector fare during all of this, considering the grief with China?
Look, it looks like China is beginning to use its buying of our exports to achieve political gains. They're not kind of saying that, but the 80% tariff on barley, they seem to have admitted that the barley wasn't being dumped, and it seems to have been a punitive tariff. So therefore, a few people are saying, well, maybe that's going to cause problems for our mining exporters as well if relations between Australia and China continue to deteriorate. I think it's fair to say that they need our iron ore and our coal. So I think it's less likely that those companies will suffer. And in fact, in the March quarter, there was a huge increase in iron ore exports to China as they started to buy more, and it was and also because Brazil's in trouble because of the pandemic. Their main competitor, which is Vale, looks like having to be closed down. So the iron ore price is rising because of that. So I think that at this point, our minerals exporters look okay. I think it's probably unlikely that China is going to kind of shut down the imports of that stuff to punish Australia. But look, anything's possible, I guess.
Yeah, it seems to have weathered over a bit now with support from the WHO and Xi Jinping agreeing to an investigation once we get our hands, or once we're through the pandemic. So let's see how that goes. Another question here from Kristen. There seems to be a school of economic thought that government debt doesn't really matter. The US has been there for some time. What's your view on this for Australia?
There definitely is a school of economic thought along those lines. It's called modern monetary theory, which happens to have been invented by an Australian economist named Bill Mitchell, who is the professor, or is a professor at the University of Newcastle. And he basically invented it as a way of looking at government debt rather than a thing that you kind of apply. And his proposition is that in a country that controls its currency, there is no problem. There's no end to the amount of spending and debt that they can incur because they can simply create money, which is true. And we're seeing that in Australia at the moment with the Reserve Bank buying bonds. It's basically created about $50 or $60 billion worth of money and bought bonds with that money in order to achieve the aim of keeping the 3-year bond rate at 0.25%. That's been what they've been doing. It's slightly different. It's quite different in the US and Europe and Japan, where the central banks have been printing trillions of dollars and buying all sorts of securities, bonds. In Japan, they've even bought shares in the central bank. And in America, the Federal Reserve has started buying municipal bonds and also corporate bonds. So, they're doing it with this newly created money. Now, the Bank of England has started, as all governments use their central bank as their bank, and they often have an overdraft, right? And so the UK government has an overdraft with the Bank of England. One thing that's been done there, which hasn't been done elsewhere, is that the Bank of England has increased the overdraft. So, in a way, the Bank of England is printing money to directly supply the government. Mostly what's been going on with printing money is that the central banks have been buying these securities bonds, government bonds, on the market. So they're not buying them from the government directly, they're buying them from the other people who hold those bonds, who in turn buy them off the government. In the UK, the Bank of England has started, to some extent, to directly supply money to the government. Modern monetary theory proposes that actually that could just happen all the time. But the trouble is nobody wants to do that because we don't want, and I'm in this camp, we don't want politicians thinking that there's an endless supply of money, that there is a money tree, because they'll all go mad and they won't have any limits. What we need is for politicians to believe and for it to be true that all government spending has to be funded by either taxes or debt, and the debt has to be paid back, because otherwise you end up with what happened in Zimbabwe with Mugabe just printing money like crazy, and you end up with hyperinflation, and also Weimar Germany and also Venezuela, where in each case the governments printed money in order to just finance their spending. And you ended up having to take a wheelbarrow load of money down to the bakery to buy a loaf of bread. So we don't want that. So it's an interesting situation we're in at the moment. The central banks of the world now own many tens of trillions of dollars worth of government debt, right? And the question is, what's going to happen when that debt matures? So the Reserve Bank of Australia, for example, owns $50 billion worth of government debt now. And most of it's 3 years, some 5 year, and I think they own a bit of 10 year, but mostly it's 3 and 5 year debt. So in 3 or 5 years, that debt comes due, right? So what's going to happen then? Does the government pay the Reserve Bank? Because the government owns the Reserve Bank. So are they going to pay the Reserve Bank $50 billion?
I see that happening.
And if they do, then the Reserve Bank will just give it back as a dividend, right? Or else does the Reserve Bank do they roll it over? And so the Reserve Bank just has these assets sitting on their balance sheet forever and ever, or what? I don't know. It's interesting.
It is interesting. We've got another question. Alan's thoughts on the role of technology, in particular AI and ML, in the investment industry.
What's ML?
Machine learning.
Oh, machine learning, of course. What do I think?
Sorry, all these acronyms. Artificial intelligence and machine learning. What kind of role do you think that's going to play on the industry going forward? Do you think we're going to see, it's been talked up a lot, There's certainly a lot of reference to that. Do you think it'll have a big impact?
Of course, yeah. It's already having an impact. I think, yeah. I mean, I'm one of my favourite films is Terminator 2: Judgment Day. The only question is whether the computers become self-aware and start rubbing us out, I guess, in time. But yes, I mean, I'm being kidding, but artificial intelligence is clearly has only just begun, if I can put it that way. I think that's absolutely true. Where it's heading to, I can't imagine.
Yeah, it's actually frightening if you do think about where it's heading to. Perfect. Well, I think we haven't got any more questions coming through, so we might leave it there. Thank you, Alan. Thanks very much for joining us this morning, and for all the viewers that have come to join us. Thanks for your time.
Not at all. Thank you, Andre.
Enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks. Bye.